Okay, so, that midair collision near DC, I don't
Mm.
know about you, but it definitely makes me think twice about booking my next flight.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm guessing I'm not alone in that.
No, not at all. It's completely understandable to feel a little on edge after hearing about something like that. We all want to feel safe, especially when you're thousands of feet in the air.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
for anyone out there who is feeling a little extra apprehensive about flying, maybe after hearing about this incident, we're going to do a deep dive today and hopefully give you guys some strategies to help manage those feelings. We're really going to unpack what it means to have a fear of flying, where it comes from, and most importantly, what you can do about it.
Great plan. And I think it's important to distinguish between just those everyday jitters that we all feel sometimes before a flight and a true phobia of flying, which clinically is known as aerophobia.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because not everyone who gets butterflies before takeoff has a full-blown phobia, right?
Right. Absolutely. Think about it this way. We all have those little fleeting thoughts like, oh, hope everything goes smoothly, or what if there's turbulence? But for someone with aerophobia, those thoughts become much more intense and harder to shake off. And they might even experience a cascade of physical and emotional symptoms that can really disrupt their lives.
So, like, what kind of symptoms are we talking about here? Can you paint a picture for us?
Okay, imagine this. You're at the airport, your heart starts racing, you feel that sweat prickling on your skin, your hands are clammy, you might even feel dizzy or nauseous. Emotionally, there's a wave of panic and worry, maybe even a sense of dread that's really hard to control.
Wow, that does sound really intense.
It can be. And in severe cases, people might cancel flights at the last minute, avoid travel altogether, or even have panic attacks just thinking about flying. And if these symptoms persist for 6 months or more and begin to interfere with your daily life or your ability to function normally, that's when it crosses the line from typical anxiety to a true phobia, according to Dr. Gail Saltz, who's a psychiatrist at Weill Cornell Medical College.
So we're not just talking about pre-flight jitters. This is a real diagnosable condition. And it's also way more common than you might think.
You're right. The Cleveland Clinic reports that aerophobia affects over 25 million adults in the U.S. alone.
That's a huge number. And it's interesting. It turns out that aerophobia most commonly affects people aged 17 to 34, not necessarily older adults like you might expect.
That's a great point. That might seem a little counterintuitive at first, but when you think about it, this age group is going through so many major life transitions, graduating from college, starting careers, getting married, having children. And all of these milestones can make people more aware of their own mortality and the perceived risk associated with flying.
Yeah, it's like that feeling of, I have so much to live for, so I can't risk anything happening.
Exactly. And that heightened sense of responsibility can amplify those fears. But what's important to remember is that the root cause of aerophobia isn't always as straightforward as just the fear of the plane crashing.
Yeah, there's definitely more to it than that.
Right. Dr. Saltz highlights a few key factors that can contribute to aerophobia. For some people, it might stem from pre-existing anxiety disorders or a generalized fear of enclosed spaces. Others might have experienced a past trauma, like maybe a natural disaster or a serious car accident, where their sense of safety was really shaken. And in some cases, it can even be a learned behavior from parents or caregivers who also have a fear of flying.
So it's not just one thing. It's a whole combination of different factors that can lead to this phobia.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to understand those individual triggers and anxieties if you're trying to develop effective coping strategies.
Which brings us to the question of what you can actually do if you're struggling with this fear. I'm guessing avoidance isn't the answer.
You're right on the money with that one. While skipping a flight might provide temporary relief in the moment, it actually reinforces the phobia in the long run.
So it's like giving in to the fear only makes it stronger.
Precisely, Dr. Saltz warns that by avoiding flying altogether, you're essentially sending your brain the message that your fear is valid and that you were right to avoid the situation.
So it becomes this self-perpetuating cycle where the more you avoid, the more the fear becomes entrenched.
Exactly. And that avoidance can really start to shrink your world. It limits your opportunities and experiences.
So what's the alternative then? What can people do to actually break free from this cycle of fear and avoidance? I've heard about something called exposure therapy, but I'm not really sure I understand how that works.
That's a great question. And you're right, exposure therapy, specifically exposure and response prevention therapy, is considered the gold standard for treating phobias.
Right.
And it's not as scary as it might sound. They're not just going to throw you on a plane and say, good luck.
Okay.
It's a very gradual process, and it's structured. Ideally, it's guided by a trained therapist. And it might start with something as simple as visualizations, like imagining yourself successfully navigating different aspects of flying. Like going through security, boarding the plane, taking off, landing, that sort of thing.
Okay, so easing into it.
Exactly. Then, as you get more comfortable with that, you might progress to visiting an airport, getting comfortable in that environment, maybe even watching planes take off and land.
It's like baby steps.
Yeah. And then eventually you'd work your way up to taking short flights, gradually increasing the distance and duration over time.
So it's like dipping your toes in the water before jumping into the deep end.
That's a great analogy. It's all about desensitizing yourself to those triggers and building up your confidence step by step. And what's really interesting about exposure therapy is that it actually works in a similar way to how vaccines train our immune systems.
Wait, really? I've never thought about it like that.
Yeah, so with vaccines, we're exposed to a weakened or inactive form of a virus, right? And that exposure triggers our bodies to produce antibodies, so that when we encounter the real virus, our immune systems are prepared to fight it off.
Oh, I see what you mean. So in a way, exposure therapy is like a vaccine for our minds.
Exactly. By gradually exposing ourselves to the things that trigger our anxieties, we're essentially training our brains to recognize that those fears are irrational and that we can actually handle the situation.
That makes a lot of sense. But even with that gradual approach, I'm guessing there's still going to be moments where those anxious feelings pop up. So what can people do in those moments, especially when they're actually on a flight?
Well, a big part of the therapy involves learning specific coping mechanisms to manage those feelings when they arise. So in addition to the exposure part, you're also developing these tools. Dr. Saltz recommends a few techniques that can be really helpful. One of them is meditation, which can really help to calm the mind and shift your focus away from those spiraling thoughts.
Yeah, I can see how meditation could be beneficial. But I imagine it takes some practice to really quiet your mind when you're in a stressful situation like that.
You're absolutely right. It's not something that happens overnight. But the good news is that there are so many guided meditation apps and resources available these days that can really help you develop that skill. And even just taking a few minutes each day to practice can make a big difference in how you handle stress in general, not just when you're flying.
So it's a good thing to have in your toolkit no matter what.
Exactly. Are there other practical techniques that people can use in the moment? Absolutely. Another one that Dr. Saltz recommends is muscle relaxation, which involves systematically tensing and releasing different muscle groups in your body.
Okay, I've never tried that before. How does that work?
It might sound a little strange, but this technique can actually help to alleviate physical tension and reduce feelings of anxiety.
I can see how that would be helpful, just to kind of release that pent-up energy that anxiety creates in your body.
Exactly. And here's one that's super simple but surprisingly effective. Paced deep breathing.
Okay, I've heard of deep breathing, but what's paced deep breathing?
It's a very specific technique where you inhale deeply through your nose to a count of 5. You hold your breath for a second or two, and then you exhale slowly through pursed lips to a count of 7. And the key here is to really focus on that slower exhale, which helps to activate your parasympathetic nervous system, the part of your nervous system that's responsible for calming you down.
So it's almost like hitting the brakes on your body's stress response.
Exactly. And here's a fun fact. This technique is actually used by Navy SEALs to stay calm and focused under intense pressure.
Wow, if it's good enough for Navy SEALs, I'm definitely going to give it a try. What else? Are there other strategies people can use when they're on a flight?
Of course, Dr. Saltz also talks about distractions as a really helpful way to shift your focus away from those anxious thoughts and feelings. So listening to calming music, watching a movie, reading a book, or even engaging in a conversation with a travel companion can all be really effective distractions.
Those are all great ideas, just finding things that take your mind off the situation and allow you to relax and enjoy the ride.
Exactly. And here's an interesting one that Dr. Saltz mentions intellectualization as a defense mechanism.
Okay, that sounds intriguing. Tell me more about that.
Basically, it's about using your intellect to combat fear. So, for example, someone with a fear of flying might find it helpful to research the meticulous safety checks that planes undergo before takeoff, or read up on the statistics that show how flying is actually one of the safest modes of transportation.
So it's about arming yourself with knowledge and facts to challenge those irrational fears.
Exactly. It's about empowering yourself to think critically and rationally about the situation rather than letting your emotions take over.
I love that. It's about reclaiming control. Now, I know what a lot of people are probably thinking at this point. It's like, okay, all of this sounds great in theory, but what about that lingering fear of being on that flight? What if, despite all of this, I'm still on the plane that has an issue? That's a fear that a lot of people struggle with.
Absolutely. And it's a very natural fear. It's that what if scenario that can really creep into our minds and fuel our anxiety. But here's where Dr. Saltz offers a really valuable perspective. She points out that statistically, you are far more likely to die in a car accident or even get struck by lightning than in a plane crash.
That's a powerful reminder. It's about putting the risk into perspective.
Exactly. We accept a certain level of risk in our daily lives without even thinking about it. We get in our cars, we cross the street, we engage in all sorts of activities that carry some degree of risk. But we don't obsess over those possibilities, do we?
Not usually. We just go about our lives.
Precisely. So the key takeaway here is to examine whether your fear of flying is truly proportionate to the actual risk. And in most cases, it's not.
It's about challenging that fear with logic and reason. Now, another thing that comes up, especially after events like this recent mid-air collision, is how to talk to kids about these incidents. Many parents are probably feeling extra anxious themselves. So how do you address those concerns without instilling fear in your children?
That's such an important question, and Dr. Saltz offers some great advice here. First and foremost, manage your own tone and anxiety level. Kids are incredibly perceptive, and they pick up on those cues. If you're freaking out, they're going to freak out too.
Yeah, it's like that saying, monkey see, monkey do, but with emotions.
Exactly. So take a moment to compose yourself before having the conversation. And when you do talk to them, try to limit their exposure to media coverage of the event. Seeing those same images and headlines over and over again can really amplify the fear, even for adults. So instead, focus on answering your questions honestly and reassuringly. Emphasize that while these incidents are tragic, they are incredibly rare, and that millions of flights take off and land safely every day.
So it's about providing context and reassurance without downplaying the seriousness of what happened.
Exactly, and remind them that you would never put them in a situation you didn't believe was safe. That can go a long way in calming their anxieties.
Makes sense. Now, I know a lot of our listeners are probably wondering, how long does it actually take to overcome aerophobia? Is there light at the end of the tunnel?
It is the million-dollar question, isn't it, for anybody who's struggling with this fear?
For sure, it really is. And I know Dr. Saltz talked about this.
Yeah.
So is there a magic number?
Unfortunately, there's no one-size-fits-all answer when it comes to recovery time.
Okay, so there's hope, but it's not necessarily a quick fix.
Right. Some people might see really significant improvement in just a few weeks of therapy, while others might need a longer, more intensive approach. It really varies depending on the person and the severity of their phobia. The important thing is to be patient with yourself and trust the process.
Yeah, and remember that it is possible to get better.
Absolutely. A lot of people who commit to therapy and really diligently practice those coping strategies do see significant lasting improvement. And even if those anxieties come back up at some point down the road, you'll have the tools and skills to manage them effectively.
So you're building resilience.
Exactly. You're learning to navigate those feelings and not let them control your life.
That's a great point. And I think that's a really empowering message, that you can take control and reclaim your freedom to travel and experience the world.
Absolutely. Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with something to think about. While it's so important to acknowledge and address the fear of flying, I want you to consider this. How much risk do we just accept in other areas of our lives without even thinking twice?
It's like that saying, we worry about the plane crashing, but then we drive home from the airport.
Exactly. So the challenge here is to put things into perspective. Is your fear of flying really proportionate to the actual risk involved? Are there other, maybe less dramatic risks that we accept every single day without even blinking?
That's a really interesting question. And I think a really important takeaway from all of this is that help is available and recovery is possible. Yeah.
If you are struggling with aerophobia, know that you are not alone. There are resources and therapists and strategies out there to help you regain control and reclaim your freedom to travel.
And as always, we encourage you to share your thoughts and your experiences or even your own coping strategies with us on social media.
We love hearing from you. Your insights could really help someone else who's going through a similar thing.